The spit itself made little sound, yet in the sudden silence of the Golden Spur saloon, it echoed like a gunshot. A tiny globule of spittle, ejected from the contemptuously twisted lips of Mayor Gideon Thorne, crawled slowly down the cheek of the waitress, Elara Vance, mingling with dust and humiliation. Time froze. The fiddle of a drunken musician in the corner died on a half note. Laughter from the card table choked and broke. Dozens of eyes, which had been lazily observing the scene just moments before, now bored into the girl standing with a tray in her hands in the middle of the room. Her only crime was to have accidentally splashed a drop of beer on the mayor's gleaming boot. A crime for which, in Thorne's opinion, the punishment was a public flogging of her dignity. Elara's face was as pale as canvas, but her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, did not waver. She did not cry. She did not scream. She simply stood, and in her motionless silence there was more dignity than in the entire puffed-up figure of the town's leader. Mayor Thorne, reveling in his power and her shame, scanned the room with a triumphant smirk. He was the law in this town, Redemption Creek, a town he had sculpted from mud and ambition. And this waitress, this destitute newcomer, was just another stepping stone upon which he could place his boot with impunity. It was at that precise moment, when the silence had become unbearable, when it seemed the world had shrunk to that single sordid droplet on a young woman's cheek, that a sound was heard. Not loud, but significant. The sound of a chair being pushed back. Every head in the saloon turned as one, drawn to the farthest, darkest corner of the room. There, where he always sat, Silas Blackwood was rising. If Mayor Thorne was the law in Redemption Creek, then Silas Blackwood was the very land upon which the town stood. He was the owner of the Blackwood Forest Ranch, a spread so vast it was said the sun rose and set within his domain. A man of stone, a man of myth. He rarely spoke, smiled even less, and his presence in the Golden Spur was as familiar and silent as the old oak beams overhead. He came every evening, ordered the same single whiskey, and silently watched the world from under the brim of his hat. No one dared to disturb him. No one knew what he was thinking. He rose to his full, towering height, and his shadow engulfed half the room. He did not look at the mayor. His gaze, dark and deep as a well, was fixed on Elara. He took several slow, heavy steps forward, the floorboards groaning in protest beneath his boots. The crowd parted before him like water for a ship's bow. Silas stopped in front of the girl. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from him, the faint scent of leather, tobacco, and the open range. He reached into his pocket and produced a stark white handkerchief, dazzlingly white in the dim glow of the kerosene lamps, and he did what no one in the entire world expected. Slowly, almost gently, he reached out and wiped the spit from her cheek. His fingers barely grazed her skin, but to Elara the touch was like a bolt of lightning. Then he turned to the mayor, and for the first time that evening his voice filled the saloon. It was deep, calm, but laced with a note of steel that sent a shiver down Thorne's spine. "Mayor Thorne," Silas Blackwood said, each word falling like a stone into the silence, "you have just insulted my fiancée." An explosion. A quiet, soundless explosion that shook the Golden Spur to its very foundations. Jaws dropped, eyes widened. The drunken musician dropped his fiddle. Mayor Thorne himself froze with his mouth agape, his face turning a shade of purple from a mixture of rage and bewilderment. His fiancée? This grimy serving girl? The fiancée of Silas Blackwood, the wealthiest and most powerful man for hundreds of miles around? It had to be some kind of cruel joke, an absurdity. Elara stared at Silas, the world swimming before her eyes. She knew him only as the silent shadow in the corner. In the 2 years she had worked here, he had not spoken 10 words to her. Whiskey. Another. Thanks. That was the entirety of their dialogue. He never looked her in the eye, or so she had thought. To him, she was part of the furniture, nothing more. And this man, this stone idol, was calling her his fiancée. Why? What for? Was this a dream? A hallucination brought on by the sting of humiliation? Silas gave no one time to recover. He dropped the handkerchief onto the dirty floor at the mayor's feet, a gesture more insulting than a slap. Then he took Elara by the hand. Her palm disappeared inside his huge, calloused one, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. "We're leaving," he said, as if it were the most natural decision in the world, and he led her toward the exit. No one dared to stand in their way. No one made a sound. They walked through the petrified crowd, and Elara, still unable to believe what was happening, felt hundreds of eyes on her. But the only thing she truly felt was the solid grip of the hand holding hers, and the thundering of her own heart, which pounded in her ears like a drum. The saloon doors swung shut behind them, leaving a tomb-like silence and an utterly dumbfounded mayor in their wake. The night air of Redemption Creek was cool and smelled of sagebrush. It brought Elara slightly to her senses. She stopped, and Silas, feeling her resistance, halted as well. They stood on the wooden boardwalk under the indifferent light of the stars. "Mr. Blackwood," she whispered, her voice trembling. What was that? Why did you do that?" He remained silent for a long time, gazing somewhere into the distance at the dark silhouettes of the mountains on the horizon. His profile in the moonlight was like something carved from granite. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer as steely as it had been in the saloon. It held a weariness and something else Elara couldn't quite identify. "Because I could no longer watch this town devour you, Miss Vance," he answered, using her surname for the first time. "And because it wasn't a lie. At least, I wish for it not to be a lie." And in that moment, Elara understood that the evening was only just beginning, and that her life, so quiet and predictable in its bleakness, had just taken the sharpest and most dangerous turn imaginable. But to understand the full depth of this moment, one must go back. One must understand who Elara Vance was before she became a waitress in a dusty western town, and who Silas Blackwood was before he became her silent protector. Elara was not born with a tray in her hand. She grew up in Boston, in a house that smelled of books and oil paint. Her father was a history professor, a dreamer who believed in goodness and justice. And Elara was an artist. From childhood, she saw the world not as a series of events, but as a canvas, full of light and shadow. Her fingers were always stained with charcoal or paint. She drew everything: the play of light on cobblestones after the rain, the wrinkles on an old merchant's face, the exhaustion in the eyes of dock workers. She dreamed of going to Paris, of studying with the great masters. That was her guiding star, her secret world. But that world collapsed in a single day. Her father's failed investments, made on the advice of a trusted friend, bankrupted their family. Shame and despair broke Professor Vance. He faded away in a matter of months. And Elara, at 19, was left alone with her mother and crushing debts. Everything was sold. The house, the books, the paintings. It wasn't enough. And so, like thousands of other broken souls, they succumbed to the promises of a better life out west. Advertisements screamed of fertile lands, of boom towns, of opportunity for all. The reality was brutal. Elara's mother could not withstand the arduous journey and the harsh climate. She died of a fever in the very first settlement camp. Elara was left utterly alone with a single suitcase, a few of her father's books, and a set of drawing supplies that she guarded like a holy relic. That is how she ended up in Redemption Creek, where the only job for a young woman with no money or connections was in a saloon. She hated the work, the leering stares, the crude jokes, the stench of stale liquor and sweat, but she endured. Every night, returning to her tiny room behind the laundry, she would take out her sketchbook and draw. She drew the faces of the saloon patrons, their desperation, their greed, their rare glimmers of hope. It was her salvation, her way of not losing her mind, of not drowning in the filth of this place. She held on to her dignity like a final talisman. Until this evening, until Mayor Thorne's spit. And Silas Blackwood. His story was scorched into this land by sun and wind. He was no aristocrat from the East. He was the son of a simple farmer who had come to these lands when only coyotes howled and not a single white man was to be seen. He watched his father get murdered by bandits and his mother die of cholera. At 15, he was left alone with a single rifle and his father's creed: "Never give up your land." And he never did. He clung to it with his teeth. He worked from dawn till dusk, slept with his rifle in his arms, fought off raiders and cattle rustlers. He was smart, tough, and saw 10 steps ahead. When gold was discovered nearby and people flooded the area, he didn't chase the shiny metal. He started raising cattle, understanding that all these people would need something to eat. By the time the railroad came through, his herds numbered in the thousands. He bought up land for a pittance from bankrupted prospectors and failed farmers. He built an empire. The Blackwood Forest Ranch wasn't just a ranch. It was a state within a state, with its own laws and its own army of cowboys loyal to him to the grave. But all of this came at a price. He became withdrawn, distrustful. He saw only greed and self-interest in people. Women looked not at him, but at his money. Partners tried to cheat him. He built a wall of silence and suspicion around himself. He was a king on a vast but empty chessboard. And the only place where he felt not like a king but just a man was in that dark corner of the Golden Spur Saloon. There he could simply watch life unfold without participating in it. It was there 2 years ago that he first saw Elara. She was unlike the other women in this town. There was no coquetry in her movements, no vulgarity. In her eyes, when she thought no one was looking, there was a sorrow so profound that it made his heart, the heart of a man who considered himself unfeeling, ache. But at the same time, she possessed an unbending pride. He watched her put drunken cowboys in their place with a single glance. He saw her secretly give her own dinner to a starving beggar at the back door. He began to watch her. It became his secret, his only weakness. He learned her story from the talkative bartender, and with each passing day his admiration for her grew. He saw in her what he himself so desperately lacked: purity, light, a belief in something more than just land and money. She was like a rare flower that had pushed its way through the rocky soil of his world. But what could he offer her? His gloomy house, his silence, his scarred soul? He who was accustomed to commanding was terrified of one thing: approaching her and speaking. He was afraid of seeing that same calculating glint in her eyes as he saw in others. He was afraid that his coarse world would stain and break her. And so he remained silent. For 2 years, he just sat in his corner and guarded her with his unseen presence. Everything changed that night, when Mayor Thorne, that petty, pompous turkey, dared to humiliate her. The moment his spit touched her cheek, something inside Silas snapped. The wall he had built for years crumbled in an instant. He realized that his silence was not protection, it was betrayal, a betrayal of her and of himself. And so he stood up. He didn't know what he was going to say. The words were born of their own accord. My fiancée. They sounded like the one and only correct answer to all the universe's questions. And so there they stood on the street, 2 solitary souls, the artist who had lost her world and the king locked in his empire. He had saved her from humiliation, but now they were both trapped in a cage of his own making. His words, thrown in the mayor's face, would spread through the town like wildfire. There was no taking them back. Miss Vance. Elara. Silas said her name for the first time, and it sounded unfamiliar and somehow special in the night's silence. I understand your shock, and I don't ask you to understand me right now. I only ask for one thing. Trust me. Let me take you to a safe place. And tomorrow we will figure everything out. He looked at her, and there was no longer any coldness in his eyes. There was a plea. The gaze of the most powerful man in the territory was that of a supplicant. And Elara, despite the chaos in her soul, felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, a strange, irrational sense of safety. Next to this man of stone, the world no longer seemed so hostile. She didn't know what lay ahead. Was this salvation, or an even more elaborate cage? Was this man her guardian angel, or a devilish tempter who had bought her with a single public gesture. But she knew one thing: she could no longer return to her room behind the laundry, to her former life. That path was cut off. She slowly nodded. Silas said nothing more. He simply gave her hand a gentle squeeze and led her down the street to where his carriage, black as night and drawn by 2 raven horses, was always waiting. The town of Redemption Creek, holding its breath, watched them go from the windows of its houses. A new legend was born that night, but no one yet knew if this legend would have a happy ending, because Mayor Gideon Thorne, standing in the middle of the deserted saloon, had not forgiven his humiliation, and in his small, malevolent eyes a plan for revenge was already taking shape. A plan that could burn not only Silas Blackwood and the unknown waitress to the ground, but also this entire town that thought itself saved. The tension was only just beginning to build. The journey to the Blackwood Forest Ranch took nearly an hour, and for the entire duration they rode in almost complete silence. But this was a different kind of silence from the one in the saloon. It was filled with unspoken questions, with fears, and with a nascent, fragile connection. The carriage, unlike the dusty stagecoaches, was upholstered in dark velvet and smelled of expensive leather. The smooth suspension absorbed every bump in the road. Elara had never in her life ridden in such a luxurious vehicle. This was a world that existed in parallel to her own, a world of wealthy ranchers and their ladies, a world she had only ever seen from a distance, like a picture in a high-end magazine. And now she found herself inside that picture, seated next to its silent owner. She stole glances at Silas. The moonlight filtering through the window snatched his stern profile from the darkness, the hard line of his jaw, the deep-set wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of countless hours spent under the unforgiving prairie sun. He sat motionless, his massive hands resting calmly on his knees, but Elara could see the tension in his shoulders, the clenching of his jaw. This man of stone was wound as tight as a spring. He had done something utterly irrational, something that went beyond the carefully calculated confines of his life, and now it seemed he himself didn't know what to do next. "You don't have to do this," she said suddenly, her quiet voice breaking the silence, sounding surprisingly loud in the enclosed space. Silas slowly turned his head toward her. In the dim light, his eyes seemed bottomless. "Do what, Miss Vance?" "Continue this charade," Elara managed, struggling to find the right word. "I am grateful to you, more than you can possibly imagine. You saved my dignity. But you didn't need to go this far. By tomorrow, everyone will forget. I can leave town." He gave a wry, humorless smile. "Thorne won't forget. The people in this town won't forget. Tomorrow you will wake up as either Blackwood's fiancée or the whore the mayor put in her place. There is no third option. Redemption Creek is a cruel place. It doesn't forgive weakness, and it doesn't like shades of gray." His words were like a douse of cold water. She knew he was right. The rumors must already be slithering through the dark streets, passed from mouth to mouth, growing filthier with each telling. By morning, she wouldn't be able to walk down the street without catching whispers and lewd grins, or worse, pitying glances. "But why?" she whispered, the main question that tormented her. "Why you? We don't even know each other." Silas turned back to the window. He watched the ghostly silhouettes of saguaro cactus flash by, standing like silent sentinels. "Perhaps we know each other better than you think," he said in a low voice. "I've watched you work these past 2 years. I've seen your pride. I've seen your kindness. Tonight, Mayor Thorne didn't just insult a waitress. He insulted the only truly decent thing in this rotten town. I couldn't allow that. Call it a whim of a rich man, or call it justice being served." There was something in his voice that sent a shiver down Elara's spine. This wasn't just about protecting her. It sounded like a confession. But a confession of what? She wanted to ask more, but the carriage slowed and came to a halt before a massive pair of wrought iron gates.
In the light of the lanterns fixed to the gateposts, she saw the silhouette of intertwined tree branches forged from metal and the words, Blackwood Forest Ranch.
The gates swung open slowly, and they drove onto the property. What met Elara's eyes made her forget all her questions. She had expected a large farmhouse, perhaps a few barns. But this was not a house. It was a fortress. An immense two-story building of dark stone and massive logs, with a wide veranda and tall windows in which, despite the late hour, lights were burning. It stood on a hill, overlooking the entire valley, looking at once majestic and profoundly lonely. All around, as far as the eye could see, were corrals, stables, a blacksmith's shop, houses for the ranch hands, an entire town belonging to one man, the empire of Silas Blackwood. When the driver opened the door, Silas stepped out first and offered Elara his hand. His touch was firm and steady. She stepped out of the carriage, feeling small and lost before this stone giant. On the porch, an elderly woman in a severe dark dress was already waiting for them. Her gray hair was pulled into a tight bun, and her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes were sharp and perceptive. "Martha," Silas said, nodding to her, "this is Miss Elara Vance, my guest. She will be staying here. Please prepare the guest room in the east wing, and bring up some supper." The woman, Martha, sized Elara up with a long, appraising look that made the girl uneasy. There was no hostility in her gaze, but there was a wariness and a sliver of astonishment. In all her years of service, Silas Blackwood had never once brought a woman to this house. "Of course, Mr. Blackwood," she replied in an even tone. "This way, miss." Elara cast a bewildered look at Silas, but he just gave her a slight nod, indicating that she should go. And so she went, following the stern figure of the housekeeper into the vast, echoing space of the house. Inside, the house was just as it was on the outside, massive, dark, and imposing. The walls of the great hall were adorned with deer antlers and antique firearms. A huge fireplace, large enough for a man to stand in, was cold and empty. The air was thick with the scent of beeswax, wood, and solitude. This was a home built for a large family, for laughter and life, yet it held the silence of a museum. Martha led her up a wide staircase to the second floor, down a long hallway lined with Navajo rugs that muffled their footsteps. The room they entered was enormous, far larger than her entire hovel in Redemption Creek. A four-poster bed, a carved dark wood armoire, a dressing table with a silver-framed mirror. The wide window offered a view of the sleeping valley and a myriad of stars. Everything was impeccably clean, expensive, but lifeless. "The bathroom is through here," Martha said, pointing to a door. "There is always hot water. If you require anything, pull this cord. Supper will be brought up in 15 minutes. With those words, the housekeeper left, closing the door softly behind her. Elara was alone. She walked to the mirror and looked at her reflection. A disheveled girl in a cheap, beer-stained dress stared back at her. A waitress. And that waitress was now standing in the bedroom of the richest man in the state. It was so absurd she wanted to laugh, hysterically, until tears came. She sank onto the edge of the bed, which was covered with a silk spread. What was she doing here? This was not her world. She was an intruder, an imposter. And Silas Blackwood? Who was he? A savior? A tyrant? A madman? He spoke of justice, but perhaps this was just a game to him, a way to display his power over the mayor, and she was merely a pawn in that game. Suddenly, she remembered her most precious possession. She rushed to the small reticule she had been clutching all this time and pulled out her sketchbook and a small stub of a charcoal pencil. She opened it. The last drawing was a sketch from the previous night, the gnarled hands of an old cowboy clutching an empty glass.
She looked at her own hands, trembling, stained, but this was the only thing that connected her to herself, to the Elara Vance that dreamed of Paris. She had to get out of here. Tomorrow morning, at first light. Thank him and leave. Go anywhere. Better to be hungry and homeless again than to become a beautiful toy in this gilded tomb. Meanwhile, back in Redemption Creek, in a smoke-filled back office of the saloon, Mayor Gideon Thorne was far from sleep. The humiliation burned inside him like a poison.
The mocking glances he had caught as he left the Golden Spur still danced before his eyes. Blackwood, that arrogant upstart, that silent brute who thought himself a god just because he had more acres and more cattle. He dared to publicly humiliate him over some filthy gutter snipe. Thorne paced his office like a caged animal. His power in the town was built on two things: the money he squeezed from every business and fear. Tonight, Blackwood had struck a blow against the second, most crucial pillar. He had shown everyone that the mayor was nothing, that he could be put in his place with impunity. If Thorne swallowed this, tomorrow any cowboy could spit in his direction. No, that would not happen. He stopped at his desk and poured himself a full glass of whiskey. He downed it in one gulp, not even wincing. The rage brought him clarity. A direct confrontation with Blackwood was suicide. His cowboys were a small army, so he wouldn't attack head-on. He would strike where he wasn't expected. He would strike at the foundation of his empire, his land. The mayor opened a fireproof safe and pulled out a thick folder of maps and documents. These were the plans and deeds for the entire county. He spread a huge map of Blackwood's holdings on his desk. The Blackwood Forest Empire looked impregnable, but everything has a weak spot. And Thorne knew where to look. There was one parcel of land, the most vital to Blackwood, the Silver Creek Valley. Through it flowed the only river that didn't dry up in the summer, watering the majority of his 1,000-strong herds. Blackwood had bought this land many years ago from an old Mexican family, but Thorne had always suspected that something wasn't right with that deal. Spanish land grants, issued long before this territory became American, were a headache for many landowners. They were often challenged in court, and proving their legitimacy was incredibly difficult. If he could dig up the old archives, if he could find the descendants of that family, if he could convince them they had been cheated, he could initiate a lawsuit that would paralyze Blackwood for years. And while the courts deliberated, he could use his authority to cut off his access to the water. Without water, his cattle would begin to die. His empire would begin to crumble. A smirk touched the mayor's lips. It was perfect, slow, agonizing, and, most importantly, legal. He would strike Blackwood not with a bullet, but with the pen of a bureaucrat and the gavel of a judge. As for the girl, when Blackwood started to sink, he would throw her overboard himself like useless ballast, and then she would come crawling back to Thorne on her knees. He went to the door and called for his assistant, a slimy character named Finch. "Finch," the mayor said, his eyes burning with an unhealthy fire, "I have a job for you. I need you to go to the county archives in the state capitol. Find everything related to the old Spanish grant for the Silver Creek Valley, the De la Garza family, and one more thing. Find me a man named Concho. They say he's the last of that line and is rotting away in some slum somewhere. Find him. Tell him he has a chance to become a very rich man." The next morning, Elara woke to a sunbeam striking her eyes. For a moment she didn't know where she was. The softness of the sheets, the silence, and the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting up from downstairs. And then the events of the previous night crashed down on her like an avalanche. On a chair beside the bed, she saw a set of neatly folded clothes. A simple but well-made dress of dark blue cotton, undergarments, stockings, and even a pair of sturdy leather boots. Everything was perfectly her size. It was both thoughtful
and unnerving. How did he know her size? He had been watching her far more closely than she had ever imagined. She dressed. The clothes fit perfectly. Looking in the mirror, she no longer saw a waitress, but rather the daughter of a modest farmer. It felt closer to the real her than the tawdry saloon dress. She gathered her few belongings, carefully placing her sketchbook in her reticule, and went downstairs. Silas was waiting for her in the dining room. It was a vast room with a long oak table that could have seated 30 people. But he sat alone at its head, a fact that only accentuated his solitude. In front of him was a cup of coffee and a plate with an untouched breakfast. "Good morning, Miss Vance," he said, rising to meet her. In the daylight, he looked even more imposing.
But there was a weariness in his eyes, as if he hadn't slept all night. "Good morning, Mr. Blackwood, and thank you for the clothes," she replied politely. "Please sit. Martha has made breakfast." She sat at the opposite end of the table, feeling uncomfortable with the vast distance between them. Martha silently placed a plate of eggs and bacon in front of her and poured coffee. They ate in silence for some time. Elara gathered her courage. She had to tell him her decision. "Mr. Blackwood," she began, looking at him steadily, "I am very grateful for everything, but I cannot stay here. I will be leaving today." He put down his fork and looked at her. His gaze was heavy. "Where will you go, Miss Vance? Do you have money, family, a place where you are expected?" Each of his questions was like a blow. No, she had nothing. "I'll manage," she said stubbornly. "I always have." "I have no doubt of that," he said with surprising softness. "But allow me to make you a proposal, not as a savior to a victim, but as two people who can be of use to one another." Elara grew wary. "What kind of proposal?" "As you've likely noticed, I am a solitary man, and rather, well, known in these parts. My solitude gives rise to rumors. Some say I'm cursed, others that my heart is made of stone. This is bad for business. People find it easier to deal with a family man. It makes him seem more reliable, more predictable in their eyes." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "What happened last night cannot be undone. The whole town is buzzing. If you disappear now, it will only create more filth. But if we maintain this story, it will solve the problems for both of us. You will have protection, a roof over your head, complete security. No one will ever dare to insult you again. I will provide you with everything you need. You can forget about working in the saloon. You can—" he hesitated for a moment. "You can draw again. I saw your sketchbook. Martha said you wouldn't part with it." Elara instinctively pressed her hand to her reticule. He knew everything. "And you? What do you get?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I will get—" He looked directly into her eyes, and there was such sorrow in his gaze that Elara's heart clenched. "Peace. A fictitious fiancée, and later a wife, living in my house will relieve me of the need to fend off fortune hunters and matchmakers. It would be a business arrangement, Miss Vance. A marriage of convenience. No demands, no obligations, other than the formal ones. You would be the mistress of this house, but free in your own life. And in a year or two, we could quietly separate, and I will give you enough money to go anywhere you wish. To Paris, wherever you want." It was monstrous and brilliant. He was offering her her dream, but the price was herself, her freedom, however hungry it might be, to become part of this grand deception. She was silent, weighing the pros and cons, and he watched her, waiting. And in that moment she realized she feared his refusal more than she feared her own acceptance. But before she could answer, the dining room door burst open. One of Blackwood's cowboys, a tall, weathered man, stood on the threshold. His face was alarmed. "Boss, sorry to disturb you. A rider just came from town, from Sheriff McClay. He said it's urgent." Silas broke the seal and unfolded the piece of paper. As he read, his face turned to stone. The muscles in his jaw tightened. When he looked up, there was a cold fire in his eyes. "What is it?" Elara asked, unable to bear the suspense. He slowly folded the letter and placed it on the table. Then he looked at her with a long, piercing gaze. "Mayor Thorne has made his move," Silas Blackwood said, his voice flat and icy. "He has filed a claim in the county court on behalf of a certain Concho de la Garza. He is challenging my ownership of the Silver Creek Valley. And the sheriff, his lapdog, has issued an injunction barring me from accessing the river until the court reaches a decision. My herds have enough water for 3 days." And in the ensuing silence, Elara understood. Her personal drama was over, and now, willingly or not, she found herself in the very center of a war for land, for water, for survival. And upon her decision now rested far more than just her own fate. 3 days. The phrase hung in the dining room air as heavy and lethal as a bullet waiting in its chamber. 3 days. For an empire built on thousands of head of cattle, it was a death sentence. Elara looked at Silas Blackwood's face. It had become a mask of stone, but deep within his eyes, she saw the glint of a cold, furious fire. It was the fury of a cornered wolf that has no intention of surrendering. He would fight to the last breath, to the last drop of blood. And in that moment, all her doubts, all her morning resolve to flee, evaporated. Why? She herself didn't fully understand. Perhaps it was because in the mayor's brazen, vile attack, she saw an echo of her own family's tragedy. Her father, the history professor, a man of honor and principle, had been ruined in exactly the same way, not by a bandit's bullet, but by a lawyer's pen, a fraudulent document, a legal loophole. He too had been cornered by legal means, and he had broken. He did not fight back. But Silas Blackwood was not her father. He was not going to break. And Elara, looking at him, felt a wave of defiant, stubborn fury rise within her. Fury for her father, for herself, for this silent, complicated man who, just last night, for his own mysterious reasons, had stood up for her. He had offered her a deal, but the situation had changed. This was no longer just a deal. This was a war. And in this war, she did not want to be a passive victim or a beautiful prize. She wanted to be a soldier. She took a deep breath. The distance between them, at opposite ends of the massive table, no longer seemed so great. It was now filled by a common enemy. "Yes," she said. The word was quiet, but in the deafening silence it rang out like the tolling of a bell. Silas slowly raised his eyes to her. His expression did not change, but the fire in his gaze faltered for a moment, replaced by something akin to astonishment. "Yes to what?" "Yes, Mr. Blackwood," Elara repeated, her voice growing stronger. "I accept your proposal. I will be your fiancée, your wife. And I won't leave in a year. I will stay here until we have won this war, until Gideon Thorne is lying in the same filth he tried to grind me into." For the first time since they had met, I saw him truly shaken. His stony composure cracked. He looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, not as an object to be rescued, but as an equal, as an ally he never expected to find. He was silent for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Good," he said, and that single word carried more weight than a long speech. "Good, Elara." It was the first time he had said her name without the formal miss, and that simple word warmed something inside her. Silas rose from the table. His entire being now radiated not confusion, but coiled energy like a compressed spring. He was no longer a victim of circumstance. He was a commander accepting battle. "Jake," he bellowed, his voice echoing through the vast house. The cowboy who had brought the letter vanished. Silas turned to Elara. "Please, come with me." It was not an order, but an invitation. "You are a part of this. You need to know everything." He led her into his office.
This room was strikingly different from the rest of the house. There was no ostentatious luxury here. This was a warrior's headquarters. A massive desk of solid oak was cluttered with maps, ledgers, and ore samples. The walls were covered not with weapons, but with detailed maps of his lands. A telegraph machine stood in the corner. The air smelled of leather, tobacco, and work. This was the heart of his empire. A few minutes later, 3 men entered the office. The first was Jake, the tall cowboy, his right-hand man and foreman. The second was an elderly, silver-haired Mexican man with wise, sad eyes, whom Silas introduced as Manuel, the head vaquero, who had worked for his father and knew this land better than the back of his own hand. The third was a stocky, grim-faced man with a weather-beaten face, Cooper, the ranch's head of security, a former Texas Ranger. They all looked at Elara with surprise, but no one asked a single question. If the boss brought her here, there was a reason. That was the essence of their loyalty. "Gentlemen," Silas began without preamble, "we're in trouble. Thorn has cut off our access to Silver Creek." He briefly outlined the situation. As he spoke, the men's faces grew darker. 3 days, he concluded. In 3 days, the cattle will start dying of thirst. Thorn knows this. He wants to bring us to our knees. "We can fight our way through," snarled Cooper, his hand dropping to the butt of his revolver.
Give me 20 men, and by evening, Thorn's people will be floating face down in that creek. "No," Silas replied firmly. "That's exactly what he's waiting for. He wants us to start shooting. Then he'll bring in the U.S. Marshals, and we'll lose everything. They'll crush us with the law. We have to find another way." "There are the old wells on the North Range, boss," said Manuel in his quiet, raspy voice. "But they won't provide 1/10 of the water we need. You will only delay the end by a day, no more." "We need to drive the cattle east, to the mountains," Jake suggested. "There are springs there, but it's a week's journey. We'll lose half the herd to thirst on the way." They went through the options, each one worse than the last. To fight was a trap. To seek other sources was too slow. To go to court meant watching their life's work die for months on end. Thorn had thought of everything. He had found the perfect stranglehold. Elara stood silently by the wall, listening. She looked at the enormous map of Blackwood's holdings that covered nearly the entire wall. The river, Silver Creek, was marked as a thick blue line. It was like an artery, nourishing this vast body. And now, that artery had been clamped shut. She could see desperation slowly creeping into even these strong, hardened men. And Silas stood in the center, listening, not a muscle twitching on his face. He bore on his shoulders not only the weight of his empire, but the fates of all these men who believed in him. And Elara suddenly felt immense respect for this man. He was not just a rich rancher. He was the chief of his tribe. When all options had been exhausted and a heavy silence fell upon the office, Elara took a step forward. "Excuse me," she said softly. All heads turned to her. "I don't know anything about raising cattle, but I know how to look. May I ask a foolish question?" Silas looked at her, a shadow of surprise in his gaze. "There are no foolish questions here, Elara. Speak." She approached the huge map. Her slender finger traced the blue line of the river. "You're all talking about the river, but what is this?" Her finger stopped on a section of the map several miles south of the main channel. There, among the hills, was a cluster of faint, dotted lines and a small patch marked with old, faded ink. The inscription was almost illegible. "Fuente Seca." "That's the dry fountain," answered old Manuel. "An old Spanish name, a legend, nothing more. They say a long time ago there was a powerful spring there that gushed right out of the ground, but it dried up in my grandfather's time. Now it's just a dry gorge filled with rocks, a useless place." "Legends don't come from nowhere," Elara countered. She squinted, studying the map as an artist studies a canvas, trying to catch hidden details. "Look at the contour lines. All these little streams that are now dry," she circled the network of dotted lines with her finger, "they all flow not toward the main river, but here, to this gorge.
as if the land itself remembers that this was once the center of gravity. What if the spring didn't dry up? What if it was just buried during an earthquake or a rock slide? The men exchanged glances. Skepticism was written on their faces. It was just a desperate theory from an Eastern woman who understood nothing about their land. But Silas wasn't looking at the map. He was looking at Elara. He saw the fire in her eyes, saw her mind at work. She was looking at the problem differently than they were. They saw obstacles. She was looking for an opportunity. It was precisely this kind of unconventional thinking that made men like Silas Blackwood who they were. He hadn't become the richest rancher by following well-trodden paths. He always took risks, relying on his intuition. "Manuel, did your grandfather ever tell you any stories about that place?" The old vaquero frowned, digging deep into his memory. He used to say that the water went underground, that the river hid from the greedy sun. He called the place Corazón del Agua, the heart of the water, but everyone thought they were just children's tales. "The water went underground," Silas repeated, a spark of interest igniting in his eyes. "What if it's not a fairy tale? What if, under all that rubble, there's an underground river or a cave filled with water?" "To check that, we'd have to blast the rock fall," Cooper said grimly.
"We'll need a lot of dynamite, and that will take time. Time we don't have." "We have 2 days," Silas cut in. He walked to the map and decisively pointed at the spot Elara had indicated. "Jake, take some men, all the wagons. Ride to the mines in Copper Canyon. Tell them I'll buy every stick of dynamite they have, for double the price. Cooper, you go with them, provide security. Manuel, you gather the best drillers and prepare the equipment. We leave for the dry fountain in 1 hour." He gave his orders crisply and quickly. The despair in the room was replaced by a feverish energy. There was a goal, a faint, desperate goal, but a goal nonetheless. The men filed out of the office. Silas and Elara were alone again. He walked over to her. He was so close that she could once again smell that scent of the open range, of leather and confidence. "Thank you," he said simply. "You don't know if you should thank me yet," she replied. "This might just be a foolish fantasy." "Even if it is a fantasy, you've given us something we didn't have half an hour ago." He gave a slight smile. "You've given us hope, and hope is worth blowing up a few rocks for." He paused, then added more seriously, "I'm going with them. I have to oversee this myself. You should stay in the house. It's safer here." "No," Elara said firmly, surprised at her own boldness. "It was my idea. I'm going with you." He started to object, but looking into her eyes, full of stubborn resolve, he fell silent. He saw in them not fear or a woman's whim. He saw steel, the same kind of steel that was in himself. "All right," he nodded after a long pause. "Get ready. We leave in an hour." Meanwhile, many miles away, in the dirtiest and cheapest boarding house in Redemption Creek, Mayor Thorne and his assistant Finch were talking to a man named Concho de la Garza. If Elara were to draw him, she would have used only shades of gray and brown. He was a broken, degenerate man in his 50s, with eyes clouded by cheap whiskey and hands that trembled. He was the last descendant of a once proud and wealthy family, but all that remained of their former glory was a famous surname and a sense of perpetual resentment toward the world. "So, you're saying," he mumbled, greedily eyeing the bottle Thorne had placed on the table, "this land, the valley, it's rightfully mine?" "Precisely, Senor de la Garza," Thorne said in a syrupy voice, barely concealing his disgust. "That upstart Blackwood cheated your father, paid him a pittance for land worth millions. But we will restore justice. The court will return your property to you. You will be a rich and respected man again." Concho greedily swigged whiskey straight from the bottle. A spark of avarice flared in his clouded eyes. Wealth, respect. He had forgotten what those words meant. What do I have to do?" he rasped. "Nothing," Thorne smirked maliciously. "Just sign these papers. They grant power of attorney to my lawyers. They'll handle everything. And you just wait and enjoy the anticipation of your new life." He pushed the papers and a pen toward the drunkard.
Concho, without reading, shakily scrawled his signature. In that moment, he sold not only his name, but his soul. He was merely a puppet in the mayor's hands, and he didn't even realize it. When Thorne and Finch left the squalid room and stepped onto the street, Finch asked nervously, "Are you sure this will work, boss? This guy, he's just an alcoholic." "That's exactly why it will work," Thorne chuckled maliciously. "He'll do anything, I say, for a bottle of cheap rotgut. Blackwood may be strong, but even the strongest bull can't stand when the ground gives way beneath its feet. Let him scramble for now. He has 2 days left. 2 days until his empire turns to dust, and I will be there to watch." He did not know that at that very moment, a caravan of several wagons, loaded with men, tools, and hope, was leaving the Blackwood Forest Ranch. And leading that caravan was Silas Blackwood, and beside him, on the seat of his wagon, sat a woman with a straight back and a determined gaze, the woman the mayor considered nothing more than a grimy waitress. They rode towards the setting sun, toward a gorge called the Dry Fountain. The clock had begun its countdown, and now it was not just a battle of wits. It was a race against time itself, a race where the stakes were life itself.
2 hours under a scorching sun, across land that had long forgotten the taste of rain. The dust, as fine as flour, clogged the lungs, gritted between the teeth, and coated the skin in a gray film. Elara sat beside Silas, gripping the seat of the jolting wagon, and watched the landscape transform. The fertile valley gave way to rocky foothills, where only thorny shrubs and the skeletons of cacti jutted from the earth. The air grew dry and hot, searing the throat with every breath. The cowboys on horseback had tied bandanas over their faces, leaving only their eyes exposed. Their jokes and laughter had died down, replaced by a focused, grim silence. Elara felt like an outsider in this world of harsh men and an even harsher nature, but she showed no weakness. She didn't complain of thirst, didn't ask to stop. She watched silently, absorbing every detail, as she always did. She saw the tension in Silas's back, the steady hand with which he guided the horses along a barely visible trail. He was a part of this landscape, carved from the same rock, seared by the same sun. And watching him, she felt not fear, but a strange, almost primal calm. At last they arrived. The Dry Fountain Gorge was a scar on the face of the earth, a deep canyon with sheer walls of weathered sandstone. At its bottom lay a jumble of enormous boulders, the result of an ancient rock slide that had buried everything living beneath it. Not a blade of grass, not a single lizard. Only sun-baked stones and a resonant, dead silence. "The heart of the water," Elara whispered, looking at this lifeless place. Now her theory seemed like the ravings of a madwoman. The men, without a word, set to work. They were a well-oiled machine, each man knowing his task. They unloaded the equipment, the heavy drills, winches, pickaxes, shovels, and most importantly, crates of dynamite, which they handled with the tenderness and caution one would reserve for a newborn. The first day was hell. They drilled test holes in various spots, relying on Manuel's experience and intuition. But time and again the heavy drill bit hit solid rock. The sound of metal grinding against stone echoed through the gorge, fraying everyone's nerves. The sun beat down from its zenith, and the heated rocks radiated warmth. The men worked with their shirts off, their backs gleaming with sweat and coated in a layer of red dust. Water from the barrels was rationed in carefully measured portions. Silas worked alongside them all. He didn't sit in the shade giving orders. He hauled rocks, helped set up the drill. His face and hands were as black with grime and sweat as those his lowliest worker. And this commanded respect. He wasn't just the owner, he was their leader. By evening of the first day, they had made no progress, no sign of water, not the slightest moisture in the rock they brought up. Despair began to hang in the air, mingling with the dust. The men sat silently around the campfire, chewing on salt beef and staring into the flames. No one wanted to talk about failure, but everyone was thinking it. They had 1 day left, just one. Elara sat a little apart, on the rim of the gorge, sketching in her notebook. She wasn't drawing the landscape, she was drawing their faces.
The exhaustion in Jake's eyes, the deep lines of worry on Manuel's brow, Cooper's stubbornly clenched jaw, and Silas's face, inscrutable even by the firelight, but with a faint shadow of doubt at the corners of his mouth. She drew to keep from thinking, to avoid succumbing to the general despondency. "I thought artists drew beautiful things," a familiar low voice said from behind her. Silas had approached without a sound. He stood beside her, looking over her shoulder at the page in her notebook. "Sometimes there is more truth in exhaustion and despair than in beauty. And truth can be a kind of beauty, can't it?" He sat down on a rock beside her, in silence. They sat for a long time, watching the stars, which seemed huge and close in this desert, like scattered diamonds on black velvet. "Why are you doing this, Elara?" he asked suddenly. "You don't owe me anything. You could have just stayed at the house or left. Why are you here in all this dust and hopelessness?" Elara put down her sketchbook. "Because I'm tired of running," she answered, looking him directly in the eye. "My whole life, since my father's death, all I've done is retreat. From debts, from hunger, from humiliation. Last night in the saloon, when that happened, for the first time I saw someone who didn't retreat. You moved forward. And I realized I don't want to be the one who gets saved anymore. I want to be the one who fights alongside." Her words hung in the night silence. Silas looked at her for a long time, and there was something new in his gaze. Admiration. And something else, deeper and more vulnerable. "I watched you for 2 years, he said in a low voice, as if confessing to a crime. "I sat in my corner and watched. At first it was just curiosity, a different face, not like the others. Then I started noticing the details. The way you straighten the tablecloth on an empty table so it lies perfectly flat. The way you smile when the old man comes into the saloon with his dog. The way sadness comes into your eyes when the musician plays some tune from the East. I collected a whole gallery of such moments, and I realized I was falling in love with you. But I was afraid. I, a man who fears neither bandits nor drought, was terrified to approach you. I was afraid you would see me as nothing but a bag of money. I was afraid my coarse world would break you. My silence was my cowardice." Elara listened, holding her breath. The world had shrunk to his voice and the starlight reflected in his eyes. The man of stone was baring his soul to her, and beneath the rock she found a living, suffering heart. "So last night, when I stood up, I wasn't just fighting for you. I was fighting for myself. For the right, just once in my life, not to be a coward." She didn't know what to say. She simply reached out and touched his calloused, scratched hand, and that simple gesture said more than any words could. That night, in the middle of a dead desert, under the indifferent stars, something real was born between them. Not a deal, not an alliance, something fragile and powerful at the same time. The morning of the second day began with grim determination. There was no more time for testing. They had to pick one spot and bet everything on it. The men gathered around Silas and Manuel, who were studying the gorge floor. "Here," the old vaquero said suddenly, pointing to a spot at the base of a sheer cliff face. "My grandfather used to say the water hid where the cliff's shadow never leaves, in the coldest place." It was illogical. It went against all the rules of finding water. But there was no time for logic. While they prepared to drill, Elara walked over to the spot. She looked at the rock not as a geologist, but as an artist. She didn't just see rock, she saw its texture, its color. And she noticed something no one else had. A faint hairline crack running from the very top of the cliff down to the spot Manuel was pointing to. And along this crack, the color of the rock was just slightly darker, as if invisible moisture had been seeping out for centuries. "Here," she said, pointing to a spot just to the left of where Manuel had indicated. "Drill here, right into this crack." Cooper gave her a skeptical look, but Silas stopped him. He walked over, looked at the cliff, then at Elara. He couldn't see the crack, but he saw the absolute certainty in her eyes. He made his choice. He bet everything not on the old vaquero's experience, but on the artist's intuition. "Do as she says," he commanded. The work resumed with renewed vigor. The drill bit into the rock. 1 meter. 2. 5. The stone yielded grudgingly. An hour passed. 2. The sun began to dip toward the horizon. Their time was running out, and then suddenly, the drill plunged into a void. One of the workers holding the handle nearly fell over. A dead silence fell over the gorge. Everyone froze. "We found it," Manuel whispered, crossing himself. "An underground cavern." "Everyone back," Silas roared. "Cooper, prepare the charge." They worked quickly and efficiently. They packed the dynamite into the borehole, unreeled the long fuse. Everyone took cover around a bend in the gorge. Elara could feel her heart pounding. It was all or nothing. Silas lit the fuse himself. The fiery serpent raced across the ground. The moments stretched into an eternity. And then the earth shuddered. A deep, powerful explosion rocked the gorge. With a deafening roar, rocks rained down from the cliff. When the dust settled, everyone rushed forward. What they saw made them freeze. The blast had torn a huge hole in the cliff face, a dark chasm from which a damp coolness emanated. But there was no water. "Is it empty?" Jake breathed out.
Despair, cold and sticky, enveloped them all. This was it. They had lost. And in that moment, from the depths of the dark chasm, a rumble began. Quiet at first, then growing louder and louder. The ground beneath their feet vibrated. And from the hole, first as a trickle, then with growing power, gushed water, clean, cold, living water. It burst forth like a beast freed from its cage and roared down the gorge floor, filling it, washing over the stones, sweeping away the dust and despair. For several seconds, everyone stood in stunned silence. And then one of the cowboys let out a wild, exultant yell, and that yell was taken up by the others. They shouted, laughed, hugged each other, splashed in the water like children. They had won. They had done the impossible. Silas stood motionless, watching this miracle. And then he turned to Elara. His face, black with gunpowder and dust, was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. He said nothing. He simply walked over and pulled her to him, and their lips met in a long kiss, salty with sweat and tears. It was a kiss in the midst of the world they had created, to the sound of the water that was bringing life back to the dead desert. At this moment of triumph, riders appeared on the gorge rim. Leading them was Mayor Gideon Thorne. His face was contorted with fury and disbelief. Finch cowered beside him, along with several hired guns. "What's going on here, Blackwood?" he shrieked when he saw the water. "What right do you have—" "The same right you had, Mayor," Silas answered calmly, moving Elara behind him. "We were just looking for water on my land." "Your land?" Thorne laughed maliciously. "I'm afraid I have bad news for you. This land, like the valley, is the subject of a legal dispute. Here is an injunction from the judge forbidding any work." He brandished a piece of paper from his pocket. But Silas didn't even glance at it. He just gave a wry smile. "I'm afraid you're too late, Thorn, and your piece of paper is nothing more than that. You know, we have a wonderful thing these days, the telegraph. While my men were drilling rock, my lawyer in the state capitol was digging through the archives, and he found some interesting things. For instance, the fact that the true and sole heir to the De la Garza grant died 10 years ago, childless. And your Concho is an impostor, a distant relative from a minor branch of the family with no legal claim whatsoever. That's called fraud, Mayor. Grand fraud." Thorn's face went white as a sheet. "But that's not all," Silas continued, his voice turning to ice. "My lawyer also found the deeds to several mines and saloons in town, registered to front men, and all the threads lead back to your office, Mayor. That's called corruption and abuse of power. I think the federal prosecutor, who will be arriving on tomorrow's stagecoach, will be very interested to look at these documents." Thorn froze. His world was collapsing. The intricate web he had spun for years was tearing apart in an instant. He was exposed, humiliated, crushed. In desperation, he drew his revolver. "I'll kill you, Blackwood." But he didn't even have time to raise his arm. There was a sharp crack, and the revolver flew from his hand. Cooper, the former ranger, stood with a smoking Colt in his hand. His draw had been lightning fast. Thorn's hired guns, seeing this, hastily turned their horses and galloped away. The mayor was left alone, in the middle of the desert, unarmed and pathetic, surrounded by the grim faces of Blackwood's cowboys. Silas slowly walked up to him. He didn't strike him. He just looked him in the eye with cold contempt. "Get out of my state, Gideon. If I see your face in Redemption Creek by tomorrow evening, I will hand you to the prosecutor, and you will rot in prison. The choice is yours." Thorn, stumbling, picked up his revolver from the dust, scrambled onto his horse, and without looking back, spurred it into a gallop, riding off into the sunset, toward his own inglorious end. A year passed. The Blackwood Forest Ranch was transformed. Laughter now often echoed through the great stone house. An easel stood on the veranda, and the walls, instead of old firearms, were hung with paintings, vibrant landscapes and portraits, full of life. Elara Vance Blackwood had found her calling. She did not go to Paris. She realized that her Paris was here, in these vast prairies, in the rugged but honest faces of the people, in the stormy sky eyes of her husband. Her paintings, which captured the true spirit of the West, became known far beyond the borders of the state. The town of Redemption Creek changed as well. After Mayor Thorn's shameful flight, the citizens elected a new mayor, Sheriff McClay, who, having seen the power of the law in the hands of an honest man, decided to serve it faithfully. The town was cleansed of its filth and began a new life. One warm evening, Silas and Elara stood on a hill, watching the sun set behind the mountains. Below, in the valley, their herds grazed peacefully, and a cool, life-giving breeze blew from the new river channel that flowed from the dry fountain. "Do you ever regret staying?" Silas asked, his arm around her shoulders. Elara leaned against him. "How can you regret finding your home?" she smiled. "I searched for beauty in faraway cities, but I found it here, in the heart of the desert, and in the heart of a man who taught me how to fight." He kissed her gently. The empire of stone and land had found its soul. The man of stone had found his heart of water, and their story, which began with a humiliating spit in a dirty saloon, became a legend of how love can be born, even in the driest of deserts, and how true strength lies not in gold or power, but in dignity, courage, and the ability to see a treasure where others see only emptiness. A story that proves that sometimes the bravest act is not to fire a gun, but to extend a hand. What do you think of their story? Share your thoughts in the comments, give this video a like if it moved you, and be sure to subscribe to the channel because there are so many more incredible stories in the world just waiting to be told.